Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. I would like to share some of the work that I have been doing along with our partners as part of especially flagship projects 1 and 6 of Tigris. And this work has been particularly with tribal populations in Bihar, Jharkhand, amongst the Santals, and Odisha and Telangana. So the title of my talk really, I'm going to focus on achieving equitable and sustainable food systems. What are some of the creative tools we have used for farmer engagement? So the key question of Tigris, which we were addressing around what a sustainable food system should look like, was really focusing on engagement strategies with rural communities that can contribute to an enhancement of well-being, in particular improving health and nutrition outcomes. We took a gender lens and an intersectionality lens that is really focusing on women farmers, but also those amongst the poorest, amongst the indigenous, those who were agricultural workers. Side by side, we also focused on youth and developing youth strategies for youth engagement in the transformation of food systems towards greater equity and sustainability. So our starting point really was the poor nutritional status of these communities. I think this has been reinforced by the very recently released Global Nutrition Report 2021, as also the National Family Health Survey 5, which really shows that there has been no progress over the last 5 to 10 years in under 5 wasting. In fact, this has worsened, and also anemia, which seems to have increased from 52% to 53%. While there has been some improvement in under 5 stunting, we find that this is really amongst the top 2 wealth quintiles, and India still does worse than the rest of Asia at 34%. So I think this is really a starting point which we are well aware of, and this is where we wanted to find out what is the reason and how can we bring change. So what did we do? We decided in terms of our methodology to adopt a participatory action research methodology, and this really involved 4 steps. The first was a baseline to understand the livelihood, food and health knowledges and practices of communities across different agroecological and socio-demographic contexts. We had a methodology workshop in Koraput, in Odisha at the start of the project to actually work out this baseline methodology. Based on a preliminary analysis of the findings, and I will just come to this in a minute, we developed the next step, which was actually what kinds of actions or interventions we were going to take with the local communities to critically question and address some of these issues around food, nutrition, and health security. At the same time as doing this, we also tried to develop contacts and engagement with multiple stakeholders at multiple levels, whether it was at the community level, whether it was field level functionaries like Ashas and Anganwadi workers, district officials, state health and nutrition missions, civil society networks, and other government officers and policy makers. And the final and 4th step, which I will talk about, is we have tried to use all this information to develop context-specific material or curricula on health and nutrition, focusing specifically on indigenous people, but also more broadly, which will be acceptable to different stakeholders and also scalable. So very briefly on our key findings, I guess many of these are known and it doesn't come as a surprise, but we did find that there are growing vulnerabilities of farming systems to climate change and variability, and the measures to address this in order to make systems more resilient are still lacking in terms of information, technologies, knowledges, and so on. Instead, in many of these areas, there has been a focus on monocropping, including contract farming, like in Koraput and in central India, there is a lot of eucalyptus farming, which has led to constraints on biodiversity, but also on food and nutrition security. And I think it has had interesting implications in terms of gender relations, particularly women's access to land. Many of the uplands where diverse crops used to be grown have now been given over to monocropping and contract farming. In effect, women losing access to these lands for their food security. The third issue, which you can see in these photographs, is male migration as a result of this uncertainty of agriculture and a feminization of both the rural and agriculture, alongside lack of access to technology, information, and resources, which is very critical in tribal populations in indigenous parts of India, where I'm focusing on in this presentation. So on many of these issues, these first four issues, we are in the process of either writing or completing academic outputs and other kinds of dissemination. But the final one is the interesting one, which is we found a very strong, not just physical destruction because of the type of cropping patterns, but also a social devaluation and an exclusion of indigenous food and nutrition knowledges and practices from formal institutions, whether this was to do with foraged foods, uncultivated foods, whether it was in terms of local recipes, what was the local consumption practices, and all the messaging and knowledge is really around, which is top down, which is coming from non-indigenous cultures and knowledges. So this is what we decided actually to focus on in terms of our action interventions. We designed these at 4 levels. So children, youth, women's self-help groups, and frontline workers, with a range of strategies around each of these stakeholders or each of these levels within the community. Because community also we found when we were engaging that this needs to be differentiated. There are different stakeholders even within the community, and a one-size-fits-all approach will not really work. So I will just now say a little bit about each of these levels and what we have done. So starting with children, we reviewed the Bihar and the Jharkhand state curriculum for classes 6 to 8 under the environmental sciences or the EVS, and we found a complete invisibility of the Santhal culture, including food names, practices, relationship with forests, and so on. There was no mention at all of uncultivated foods. So we decided to focus on creating supplementary materials for children using local stories around foods, nutrition, health. We are in the process of preparing some illustrated books for children in the local Santhali language. We have also tried to work through the local youth, which I will come to in a minute, who are the local youth whom we have trained as nutrition mentors with the children, especially in the time of COVID. And this picture that you see is, I will talk about this, the interactive voice response system, but because of school closures, the children were all at home. Our youth mentors, our youth champions actually started recording lessons on these mobile phones, which the children could listen to. But they are also developing materials for teachers in terms of really understanding what are the nutritive values of local foods, what is available, and so on, and the meanings of different practices. So this has been our twin focus in terms of dealing with children, supplementary material for children, but also building teacher capacity. So as I said, the youth has really been the core focus, if I may say, the most important intervention in the last 2 years, creating spaces for youth voice. We secured additional funding from the UKRI through a Global Research Translation Award for this work, and which we have used actually to build the youth skills in terms of communication, documentation, and so on. We had training in filmmaking, in theater, in the use of photo voice, in stories, and so on. A very important part of this was, as I said, the interactive voice response system based on the mobile phone technology. And the youth, what they have done during the COVID last 18 months, when we were not able to visit there regularly, we were very fortunate in actually having put in place some of this training between January and March 2020, before the lockdowns started. And the youth have really used this opportunity and the equipment, like the cameras, which we gave them, to develop whole sets of films, more than 60 films, which they have then screened at the community level. They have done some local theater, which you see on the photo on the left. To raise some of these issues, they have discussed it with local communities and got feedback. The older members of the community have actually come closer to the youth, because the youth have been interviewing some of them, but also getting feedback on what they are documenting from this process. This has been very insightful for us in terms of not just generating a lot of local knowledge, but also generating discussion on food and nutrition security within the community, facilitated by the local youth, but also, I think, raising issues of inequality, especially gender inequality in some of the food practices. So, this is a local awareness that has come from within. Our third stakeholder has been women, particularly working with women's self-help groups. This has been an entry point for many activities at the community level. But it has really been centered on generating content for promoting the IVRS at the community level by mapping local foods, cultivated and uncultivated foods, what are the indigenous knowledges, choices, practices. On the right, you can see a young person actually recording at a women's self-help group meeting with one or two women about dietary diversity, about the constraints they face, the opportunities they have in terms of their food. The other thing that we have done as part of this documentation is really partnering with colleagues at NetPro, nutritionists, to do a nutritive analysis of some of these recipes to identify the shortfalls in terms of macro and micronutrients. And we are still working on this. This is a work in progress. We hope in the next month or two to take back some of this nutritive analysis in the form of menu templates to these women's groups and communities and discuss with them what is possible. As I said, an important issue that has emerged as part of these discussions has been around gender inequalities in access to resources, in access to information, in access to technologies, including exclusion of women from decision making at the farmer producer organization level. We have written a paper on this, but given the present government's focus on developing 10,000 farmer producer organizations as a way of farmer engagement and empowerment, I think a very important lesson from our work is that how do we actually find ways of dealing with this issue of inequality. So at the final level, I would like to talk about scaling up our research insights. So here what we did is we got particularly feedback from the frontline workers, the Ashas and the Anganwadis, through knowledge, attitude, practices surveys that we did with them, that while they have a very basic training on health, on childcare, on nutrition, actually the amount of information that they have on food security and nutrition is very limited. And even where they have the knowledge, they don't really know how to translate it into practice using local resources, because there are issues of affordability, accessibility, and so on, and gaps in what their knowledge is and how to convert it into practice. So based on all this information, we have partnered with IGNU, the Indira Gandhi National Open University, and developed a 4-credit free open access MOOC, which is presently being run on the Ministry of Human Resource Development's Swayam platform. The focus here is both on content in terms of sustainable food systems, but also in terms of processes of how to effectively communicate with local communities, including using digital tools, so that we take on board the voices from the field, we take on board the constraints from the field in developing much more sustainable practices. This is a flyer for the course, which has been called Creative Communication Extension and Community Resource Management for Sustainable Development. And this is open to graduates and postgraduates, but we are presently working on a Hindi translation, which will be particularly valuable for frontline workers. So the last slide, really, I would like to talk about moving ahead. How do we move ahead? Really, there is 3 strategies here in terms of moving ahead. The first is, very importantly, that we know what we need to do, but we really need to develop on the ground level the capacities of youth and frontline workers. Investing in capacities is very important. And we really feel that the MOOC that we have developed is online platform. It is also credited, but it can be done by anybody. It is free, and it will really give some clues and tips in terms of youth, frontline workers, graduates, agri-extension workers, in terms of how do we understand the issues at hand in a systems framework as sustainable food systems, the links between production right through to consumption, gender inequality, and so on, and also what are the methodologies that we have in terms of engagement. The second area we feel is in terms of engaging or collaborating with local universities, with NGOs, with departments to carry forward the processes we have set in motion and further develop context appropriate strategies and intercultural policies for food and nutrition security, especially with indigenous groups. And the final one is, I think, very important, which through Tigris, we had an opportunity for interdisciplinary research. That how do we strengthen the interface between scientists, this include natural scientists, nutritionists, social scientists, and indigenous groups and communities to build evidence on the efficacy of different knowledges and how can these be harnessed to build equitable, resilient, and sustainable food systems. I would be very happy to discuss some of these issues going ahead. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening. Thank you.